So Hebrews 13 has it's kind of filled with some some of the greatest hits from the New Testament, as we were just reflecting on a minute ago. And I think so. I'm going to read. This is Hebrews 13, starting in verse 1 through the first part of verse 5. And I think there's a few things that I would invite us to think about and remember this morning. First, remember as we read this text, just consider and remember the ways that this text describes a love that really breaks social norms. It breaks the sort of boxes that we love to create to you know compartmentalize life in society. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with structure and compartmentalization. Like that's a fundamental need to survive in this world. And yet at the same time, consider how this describes a love that breaks a lot of those boxes, breaks those expectations. Second, I think it's important for us to remember that remember Jesus's declaration that our identity as his disciples will be reflected by our love for one another. Right? That's one of the defining moments in the ministry of Jesus, where he says, "A new commandment I give you: love each other as I have loved you. People will know that you are my disciples by how you love one another." That is our defining characteristic. That is our defining trait as followers of Christ. And third, I think we can remember the encouragement that we find in Romans 12 from the Apostle Paul. He says, "Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." So this morning, as we read a description of love that breaks boxes, we remember Jesus' declaration that we are defined by our love for one another, and we are challenged to refuse to be conformed to the patterns of this world. Let's read Hebrews 13, verses 1 through 5, and consider the ways that it's describing a love that just doesn't make sense. So, Hebrews 13, let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them, those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. Let marriage be held in honor by all, and let the marriage bed be kept undefiled, for God will judge fornicators and adulterers. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. So in just a few sentences here, we have the writer of Hebrews describing a love that is mutual, a love that is radically hospitable, with, to the extent that it has otherworldly implications and effects, that angels themselves have been entertained by a hospitality that is just radical and welcoming of the stranger. It's a love that willingly enters into the suffering of others, not in a sort of charitable kind of way, but actually says enter into the suffering of others in ways that where you're not just sort of doling out a sympathetic, token of charity, but you're remembering those who are in prison as if you were in prison yourself. You're entering into the suffering of those being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. So there's the challenge to move the love from sympathy to empathy, to walking with someone in their suffering. It's a love that honors commitment, and with marriage, it's a love that embraces self-control, a love that denies greed, a love that practices contentedness. When's the last time you woke up in the morning and you're like, you know what, I'm content with all that I have, and I don't need any more than this. This is great. And so it's just in just 4.5 verses here, we have a love that takes our understandings of the boxes and societal norms that we have come to sort of grow up in and be shaped by, and says, break all of those. Don't be conformed to those patterns, but be transformed by this sort of way of living. Live this out. And by the way, remember that Jesus says you are defined by the way that you love one another. People will know that you're my disciples by how you love one another. So before we move forward and just feel this like burden, this weight of, man, I gotta love better, remember first, before you march forward and all that stuff, remember first that God loves you in ways that are bigger than any box you can imagine. And so God leads with loving you in this kind of way. Whatever box you think God fits in as far as his love for you, it's bigger than that. And so the sort of mind blowing, box breaking, structure shattering love of God for you is always available, always ready, always offered by God to you. Receive that this morning. Receive it in ways that it renews your heart, soul, mind, and strength, transforms everything of who you are. Remember that God's love for you is beyond description and is always accessible. And as you receive that, as you experience that, as you open your hands to receive that love of God, may that transform you and renew you and invite you and compel you to practice the love for others today that defines us as Christ's followers and is described here in the Hebrews 13, 1 through 5. Maybe so.